The blood-soaked sunset cast long shadows across the dusty plains of Independence, Missouri, as Samuel Ironwood rode toward the lonely ranch that had become both his sanctuary and his prison. The year was 1875, and the war that had taken everything from him had been over for a decade, yet the battles still raged within his mind every time he closed his eyes. Samuel dismounted his chestnut mare with practiced ease, his movements fluid despite the old bullet wound in his left shoulder that ached with the coming storm. At 32, he moved like a much older man, weighed down not by years but by ghosts. The homestead stood as he'd left it that morning, silent and empty, save for the livestock in the barn and the whiskey bottle awaiting him on the kitchen table. He unsaddled his horse, taking care with each buckle and strap. The animals were the only living things that received his gentleness now. To the rest of the world, Samuel presented nothing but cold, hard edges, a man to be avoided, feared, or pitied, depending on who you asked in town. "Another day gone, Bess," he murmured to his mare, running a hand along her neck. "Nothing changed, nothing gained, nothing lost. Except time. Always time, slipping away meaningless as sand through fingers. The ranch had once been vibrant with life. His father had built it with dreams of a legacy, his mother had filled it with laughter, and his wife, Elizabeth, had promised to help him carry that dream forward. Now, 6 years after the epidemic that had taken them all within a fortnight of each other, Samuel lived like a ghost in his own home, tending cattle by day and battling memories by night. Independence had grown since the end of the war. The town bustled with new opportunities as the railroad expanded westward. Samuel avoided it when possible, making the journey only when supplies ran low or cattle needed selling. Tonight, though, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon, he knew he'd need to ride in come morning. The roof of the barn had developed a leak, and he couldn't put off repairs any longer. As predicted, rain pounded against the windows through the night, finally releasing Samuel from fitful sleep just before dawn. He dressed in the dim light, pulled on his worn boots, and set his hat firmly on his head before venturing out into the muddy yard. The storm had passed, leaving behind puddles that reflected the brightening sky. The ride into town was slow going. The road turned to thick mud that sucked at Bess's hooves. By the time the buildings of Independence came into view, the sun had climbed high enough to start drying the earth, steam rising in ghostly wisps from the ground. Main Street was already alive with activity when Samuel tied Bess to the hitching post outside Henderson's general store. Wagons rolled past, carrying goods and people. Children darted between buildings, their laughter a foreign sound to Samuel's ears. He ducked his head beneath the brim of his hat, avoiding eye contact with passers-by as he pushed open the door to the store. The bell above the door announced his arrival, causing several heads to turn. Conversations quieted momentarily before resuming at a lower volume. Samuel was used to this reaction. His reputation as a recluse, combined with his intimidating stature and the perpetual storm in his blue eyes, made people uneasy. "Mr. Ironwood," Old Man Henderson greeted from behind the counter. "What can I help you with today?" "Need nails and tar paper for the barn roof," Samuel replied, his voice rough from disuse. "Got a fresh shipment just yesterday. How many pounds of nails you needing?" As Henderson gathered the supplies, the bell above the door jingled again. Samuel kept his eyes on the counter, not interested in whoever had entered. But then a soft voice with an accent he couldn't quite place filled the store. "Excuse me, I'm looking for Mr. Henderson." "That'd be me, miss," Henderson replied, his tone warming considerably. Samuel glanced sideways, curiosity getting the better of him. The woman who stood in the doorway was unlike anyone he'd seen in Independence before. Her dark chestnut hair was pulled back in a simple knot, but errant curls had escaped to frame a face that spoke of both strength and gentleness. Her dress was practical but unmistakably Eastern in its style. "Abigail Davidson," she introduced herself, extending a gloved hand to Henderson. "I sent a telegram last month about the teaching position." "Miss Davidson." "Yes, indeed, we've been expecting you. The stage wasn't due until tomorrow." She smiled, and something in Samuel's chest tightened unexpectedly. It had been years since he'd noticed such things about a woman. "The stage made better time than expected. I arrived late last night and stayed at the hotel." "Well, this is fortunate timing. The school board is meeting this afternoon. I'm sure they'd be pleased to meet you straight away." Henderson turned. "Oh, Mr. Ironwood, your supplies." Samuel stepped forward to collect his purchase, unavoidably drawing the attention of the newcomer. Her eyes, a warm amber that reminded him of autumn sunlight through whiskey, met his briefly. Most people in town looked away quickly when he met their gaze, but she held it for a moment, offering a polite nod. "Good day, sir," she said simply. Samuel touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, but said nothing as he paid Henderson and gathered his supplies. As he turned to leave, he heard Henderson's excited chatter about the town's desperate need for a teacher and how the children had been without proper schooling since poor Miss Winters took ill last winter. Outside, Samuel secured his purchases to Bess's saddle. The encounter in the store had unsettled him in a way he couldn't define. He'd gone years speaking only when necessary, keeping to himself, and feeling nothing but the dull ache of loss. Yet a stranger's voice and a pair of amber eyes had momentarily pierced the fog that surrounded him. He mounted Bess and turned her toward home, deliberately pushing thoughts of Abigail Davidson from his mind. Independence was a growing town. Newcomers arrived regularly. This one would have no more impact on his solitary existence than any other. Samuel was wrong. 2 weeks later, Samuel found himself once again in town, this time seeking the blacksmith. One of his plow horses had thrown a shoe, and while he could handle most repairs on his own, some tasks required expertise he didn't possess. As he led his horse down Main Street, a commotion from the direction of the schoolhouse caught his attention. A crowd had gathered, their voices raised in what sounded like argument. Ordinarily, Samuel would have continued on his way, but something curiosity, perhaps, or some half-forgotten sense of civic duty made him pause. The schoolhouse was a simple wooden building that had seen better days. On its steps stood Miss Davidson, her back straight as a ramrod as she faced down 3 men Samuel recognized as members of the town council. Behind her, peering out from the schoolhouse door, were a dozen or so children of various ages. "The arrangement was clear, Miss Davidson," Councilman Porter was saying, his jowly face flushed with indignation. "The school serves the children of Independence." "All the children of Independence," Miss Davidson replied, her voice firm but calm. "These children live within the town limits. Their parents work here, contribute to this community." "They're squatters at best," Porter retorted, "and Mexicans and Indians at that. The school was built for children who need education," Miss Davidson interrupted, "and that's precisely who I intend to teach." Samuel noticed now the children behind her, several dark-haired, dark-skinned children among the fair-haired ones. Children from the settlement on the outskirts of town, where migrant workers and displaced natives had formed a makeshift community that most of Independence pretended didn't exist. "This is not Boston or New York, Miss Davidson," Porter continued, lowering his voice to what he clearly thought was a reasonable tone. "We have ways of doing things here, traditions. Education is not a tradition, Mr. Porter. It is a necessity and a right. These children's parents have paid the same school fee as everyone else. Porter's face darkened further. Then perhaps we need to reconsider your position here. A murmur went through the crowd. Even Samuel, as disconnected as he was from town affairs, knew that independence had struggled for months to find a teacher willing to come this far west. Miss Davidson's spine seemed to straighten even more, if that were possible. Perhaps you should. In the meantime, I have a lesson to teach. She turned her back on the councilmen and ushered the children inside, closing the door firmly behind her. The crowd began to disperse, some muttering disapprovingly, others looking troubled. Samuel remained where he was, strangely moved by what he had witnessed. It had been a long time since he'd seen someone stand up for what was right, regardless of the consequences. As the last of the onlookers drifted away, Samuel continued toward the blacksmiths, his thoughts unexpectedly occupied by Abigail Davidson and her quiet courage. 3 days later, the spring rain returned with a vengeance. Samuel had spent the morning securing his livestock and checking fences, and by midday, he was soaked to the skin and chilled to the bone. The sensible thing would have been to return to the house, but he had one more stretch of fence to check near the eastern boundary of his property. As he rode through the downpour, Bess suddenly nickered and lifted her head, ears pricked forward. Through the curtain of rain, Samuel spotted a figure struggling along the muddy road that passed his land, a woman, bent against the wind, a shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders. Samuel reined Bess toward the road. As he drew closer, recognition hit him like a physical blow. It was Miss Davidson, miles from town in a dangerous storm. "Miss Davidson," he called out, raising his voice to be heard above the wind. She turned, squinting through the rain. Relief washed over her face as she recognized him, or at least recognized that help had arrived, even if she didn't immediately place him. Samuel guided Bess alongside her and dismounted. "What in God's name are you doing out here in this weather?" "I was visiting one of my students," she explained, her teeth chattering. "At the settlement, the family invited me for Sunday dinner and I thought I could make it back to town before the storm worsened." Samuel glanced at the sky. The clouds were only growing darker. "Town's 5 miles that way and this storm's not letting up any time soon." He made a quick decision. "My ranch is just over that rise. You'll have to wait out the worst of it there." For a moment he thought she might refuse. A proper Eastern lady would certainly think twice before accompanying a near stranger and a man with his reputation at that to his isolated home. But Abigail Davidson surprised him again. "Thank you, Mr. Ironwood. Samuel Ironwood. Mr. Ironwood, I accept your offer gratefully." He helped her onto Bess, then took the reins and led them toward the ranch house. By the time they arrived, the rain had somehow intensified, coming down in sheets that made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Samuel ushered Miss Davidson into the house, suddenly acutely aware of the state of his home. It wasn't dirty, he maintained a basic level of cleanliness, but it was stark, utilitarian. The furnishings were minimal, the walls bare where once Elizabeth's needlework had hung. He'd put away all reminders of his past life, unable to bear the sight of them but equally unable to part with them. "I'll light the stove," he said, moving to do just that. "You're soaked through. I'll find you something dry." He disappeared into the bedroom, rummaging through a chest until he found one of Elizabeth's old dresses and a shawl. He hadn't opened this chest in years, and the faint scent of lavender that escaped as he lifted the lid sent a jolt of pain through him. He pushed it aside and returned to the main room. Miss Davidson stood exactly where he'd left her, water pooling around her boots on the wooden floor. "Here," he said, holding out the clothes. "They belong to my They're clean. He gestured toward his bedroom. You can change in there. I'll make coffee. She accepted the clothes with murmured thanks and retreated to the bedroom. Samuel busied himself with the coffee pot, trying not to think about a woman wearing Elizabeth's dress, or a woman in his bedroom, or a woman in his house at all. It had been so long since any of these things had occurred that it felt like a breach in the fortress he'd built around himself. When Miss Davidson emerged, Samuel nearly dropped the cup he was holding. Elizabeth had been petite and fair, while Abigail Davidson was taller, with curves that filled the dress in different ways. But it wasn't the fit of the dress that startled him. It was the sight of life and color in a house that had been devoid of both for so long. Thank you, she said, self-consciously smoothing the unfamiliar fabric. The dress fits well enough. Samuel nodded and handed her a cup of coffee. Sugar, he offered, surprising himself. He rarely used it himself, keeping it only out of habit. Please. They sat at the kitchen table, the rain drumming on the roof filling the silence between them. Samuel couldn't remember the last time he'd shared his table with anyone. Even when business brought other ranchers or traders to his door, he conducted it on the porch or in the barn. You have a lovely home, Miss Davidson said finally. Samuel glanced around at the Spartan surroundings and raised an eyebrow. A small smile touched her lips. Perhaps lovely isn't the right word, but it's solid. Well built. You can tell it was made to last. My father built it, Samuel said, the words coming unbidden. Added onto it over the years as the family grew, or was supposed to grow. Miss Davidson nodded, her eyes taking in the space with interest rather than judgment. You've been here a long time then, born here, left for a spell. Came back. He didn't mention the war, or that he'd returned to find his parents aging and struggling to maintain the ranch alone, or how he'd met Elizabeth in town shortly after, the daughter of a merchant who'd seen something in the serious young veteran that made her smile. I imagine it means a great deal to you, then, to have such roots in a place. Samuel considered this. Once, the ranch had represented continuity, legacy. Now it was simply the place he existed. It's home, he said finally. Miss Davidson seemed to sense his reluctance to discuss his past. She changed the subject. I must thank you again for your assistance. I'm afraid I misjudged both the distance and the weather. The settlement's no place for a lady alone, storm or no storm, Samuel said gruffly, her chin lifted slightly. The families there have been nothing but kind to me. Their children deserve education as much as any others. I wasn't suggesting otherwise, but it's rough country between here and town, and you're not familiar with it. Flash floods, sinkholes, not to mention the occasional wolf or mountain lion. She had the grace to look slightly chagrined. I'm still learning the territory, it's true. In Boston, the worst one might encounter is an overly aggressive cab driver. The mention of Boston piqued Samuel's curiosity despite himself. What brings a Boston lady to independence? The teaching position, of course. There are schools in the East, better schools, with actual buildings and books, I'd imagine. Abigail cradled her coffee cup, considering her answer. There are plenty of teachers in Boston, too many, in fact, and most schools there don't welcome a woman with unconventional ideas about education, like teaching Mexican and Indian children alongside whites. She met his gaze directly. Among other things, I believe education should be practical as well as academic and available to all, regardless of background or circumstance. She paused. You saw what happened at the schoolhouse then. I was passing by. And what did you think of it? Samuel was unused to being asked his opinion on town matters. Most people assumed they knew what he thought if they considered him at all. I think, he said slowly, that Councilman Porter has always been more concerned with how things look than what's right. Something in her expression softened, as if she'd been bracing for a different answer. "The council has given me until the end of the month to reconsider my position on the matter. After that, they'll decide whether to renew my contract for the next term." "And will you reconsider?" "No." The word was firm, decisive. "Though it may mean finding myself without a position come summer." Samuel found himself admiring her resolve, even as he questioned her practicality. Independence isn't an easy place to make a stand. Few places are, Mr. Ironwood. But if we only stood for what was right when it was easy, would it mean anything at all? Her words struck a chord in him, reminding him of convictions he'd once held, before grief and isolation had narrowed his world to mere survival. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside, something subtle had shifted. For the first time in years, Samuel found himself engaged in a conversation that went beyond the mundane details of ranch life. And more surprisingly still, he found he didn't mind. As the afternoon wore on, the rain finally began to slacken. By early evening, it had reduced to a gentle patter against the windows. "I should get you back to town," Samuel said, rising from the table where they had been talking. "Before dark." Miss Davidson nodded, gathering the shawl around her shoulders. "Of course. I've imposed on your hospitality long enough." "It wasn't an imposition," Samuel said, the honesty of the statement surprising even him. He hitched his wagon while Miss Davidson changed back into her own clothes, now mostly dried by the heat of the stove. The roads would be too muddy for her to walk, and too treacherous to risk her riding alone on horseback, even if he loaned her a mount. They set off toward town as the clouds began to break, allowing the occasional shaft of evening sunlight to pierce through. The air was fresh with the scent of rain-washed earth and new growth. Spring had arrived in earnest during that day's downpour, and the landscape seemed transformed, hints of green emerging from the winter-brown prairie. Miss Davidson sat beside him on the wagon bench, maintaining a proper distance, but not seeming uncomfortable in his company. "Thank you again, Mr. Ironwood. I'm not sure what would have become of me if you hadn't come along when you did." "Samuel," he said abruptly. "Pardon, my name. It's Samuel." He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "Seems strange to be so formal after sharing coffee in my kitchen." From the corner of his eye, he could see a small smile form on her lips. "Samuel, then. And I'm Abigail, though my students call me Miss Davidson, of course." "Abigail," he repeated, testing the name. It felt foreign on his tongue, but not unpleasant. As they approached town, the streets largely empty as people remained indoors after the storm, Samuel was struck by an unfamiliar reluctance to see their interaction end. It had been so long since he'd experienced anything resembling normal human connection that he'd forgotten what it felt like, the simple pleasure of conversation, of company. He pulled the wagon to a stop outside the modest boarding house where Abigail had taken a room. "Here we are, Miss Abigail." She gathered her damp shawl and turned to him. "Would you? That is, the Widow Barnes serves supper to her boarders at 7. There's always more than enough food, and I'm sure she wouldn't mind another at the table, as thanks for your assistance today." Samuel hesitated. The thought of a table full of strangers, of conversation and social niceties he'd long abandoned, made him want to retreat immediately to his solitary ranch. And yet, another time, perhaps, he heard himself say, rather than the outright refusal that had been on the tip of his tongue. "I have livestock to tend." Abigail nodded, accepting his excuse without question. "Another time, then." She climbed down from the wagon with his assistance. "Good evening, Samuel." "Good evening, Abigail." As he drove the wagon back toward his ranch, Samuel was struck by the strangeness of the day. For years, he had moved through life like a man underwater, seeing, hearing, but somehow removed from the world around him. Today, for brief moments, he had surfaced, drawn by the unexpected catalyst of Abigail Davidson's presence. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. Change of any kind seemed dangerous after so long in stasis. And yet, as he guided the horses homeward through the gathering dusk, he found himself replaying their conversations in his mind, remembering the way the light had caught in her chestnut hair, the conviction in her voice when she spoke of her principles. For the first time in years, Samuel Ironwood went to sleep thinking of something other than his losses. And if his dreams that night featured amber eyes and a gentle voice, there was no one there to know it but him. The following weeks brought an unseasonable warmth to Independence, hastening spring's arrival. The prairie bloomed with wildflowers, and new calves tottered alongside their mothers in Samuel's pastures. It was a time of renewal that Samuel usually observed with detached appreciation, the cycles of nature continuing regardless of human joy or suffering. This year, however, he found himself noticing details he'd overlooked in previous springs. The particular shade of blue of the first prairie violets, the way morning light gilded the new grass, the chorus of returning birds that greeted each dawn. It was as if his encounter with Abigail had somehow adjusted his vision, bringing the world into sharper focus. Samuel found himself in town more frequently than usual, inventing reasons to ride in for supplies he could have done without. Each time, he told himself it was mere coincidence that his errands often took him past the schoolhouse around the time classes were dismissed. On one such occasion, he was securing a package to his saddle outside the general store when a small voice piped up beside him. "Are you really Mr. Ironwood?" Samuel looked down to find a boy of about 8 or 9 gazing up at him with undisguised curiosity. The child's clothes were patched but clean, his black hair neatly combed, his skin several shades darker than Samuel's own. "I am," Samuel confirmed, wondering what could have prompted the question. "Miss Davidson said you helped her during the big storm, that you're a gentleman even though people in town say different." Samuel was momentarily speechless. Did she now? The boy nodded solemnly. "She said sometimes people are more than what others say about them and we should make up our own minds." Before Samuel could formulate a response, a woman's voice called out, "Miguel, your mother is waiting." Abigail hurried down the schoolhouse steps, a stack of books in her arms. She stopped short when she saw Samuel, surprise and something else flashing across her face. "Mr. Ironwood," she greeted him, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. "Miguel, please don't bother Mr. Ironwood." "He wasn't bothering me," Samuel assured her. The boy, apparently satisfied with his investigation, darted off to join a woman waiting nearby. Abigail shifted the books in her arms. "I hope he didn't say anything." "Well, children repeat things without context sometimes." "He said you defended my character," Samuel said, watching her expression carefully. "That's not something I'm accustomed to." Her flush deepened. "I merely suggested that people are complex and rumors aren't always accurate." It seemed a valuable lesson in critical thinking for the children. Samuel found himself fighting a smile, something that hadn't happened in so long his facial muscles felt stiff with the attempt. A valuable lesson indeed. An awkward silence fell between them, filled with unspoken questions and observations. Finally, Samuel nodded toward the books she carried. "Those look heavy. May I help you with them?" Relief crossed her face. "That would be very kind. I'm taking them to the boarding house." They fell into step together, drawing curious glances from townsfolk unused to seeing Samuel Ironwood in anyone's company, let alone that of the controversial new schoolteacher. Samuel found he didn't much care what they thought another novel sensation. "How have you been since our last meeting?" Abigail asked as they walked. Well enough. Spring's a busy time on a ranch, I can imagine. Though I must admit, my imagination is limited when it comes to ranch work. I've never been on one before. Never, she laughed, a sound that made something in Samuel's chest loosen. Is that so shocking? Boston isn't known for its cattle ranches. I suppose not. He hesitated, then said, You could see mine, if you were interested, in how a ranch works, that is. The invitation surprised them both. Samuel hadn't entertained a guest, let alone a female guest, in years. Abigail recovered first. I would like that very much. My students often speak of ranch life, and I fear my ignorance limits my ability to incorporate their experiences into lessons. Sunday, perhaps, Samuel suggested. I could bring the wagon into town after church. You attend church, Mr. Ironwood? There was no judgment in her tone, merely surprise. No, he admitted. Not anymore, but I know when services end. Understanding dawned in her eyes, understanding of what he wasn't saying about his faith or lack thereof. Sunday would be perfect. Thank you. They had reached the boarding house. Samuel handed her the books, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. Sunday, then. As he rode back to his ranch, Samuel wondered what had possessed him to extend such an invitation. Yet alongside the anxiety was a feeling he eventually recognized as anticipation, an emotion so long absent from his life that it took him miles of riding to name it. Sunday dawned clear and warm, the kind of perfect spring day that made even the most hardened heart respond to nature's beauty. Samuel rose earlier than usual, filled with restless energy. He found himself assessing his home through new eyes, seeing the worn furniture, the bare walls, the utilitarian arrangements that had served him well enough in his solitude, but now seemed stark and uninviting. It was too late to do much about it now, but he did what he could, sweeping the porch, clearing away the few dishes left from his breakfast, even cutting a small bunch of wildflowers that he placed awkwardly in a jar on the kitchen table before removing them, feeling foolish, then replacing them when the table looked too empty without them. He hitched the wagon and drove into town, timing his arrival for just after noon when church services would have concluded. He found Abigail waiting on the porch of the boarding house, dressed in a simple blue dress with a white shawl. Her hair was partially down, held back from her face with combs but falling in waves past her shoulders. The sight of her made Samuel momentarily forget why he had come. "Good afternoon," she greeted him with a smile that transformed her already lovely face into something that made his chest ache. "I hope I haven't kept you waiting." "Just arrived," he managed, helping her into the wagon. The ride to his ranch was filled with Abigail's observations about the landscape, questions about the wildflowers that carpeted the prairie, and occasional comfortable silences. Samuel found himself pointing out landmarks, sharing bits of knowledge about the territory that he'd accumulated over a lifetime but rarely had reason to voice. "It's beautiful," Abigail said as they crested the final rise, and his ranch came into view. The afternoon sun bathed the weathered buildings in golden light, and in the distance, cattle grazed peacefully in green pastures. Truly beautiful. Samuel saw it through her eyes for a moment, not as the place of loss and memories that it had become for him, but as it might appear to someone seeing it fresh. The solid house his father had built, the well-maintained barns and corrals, the backdrop of rolling prairie stretching to the horizon. "It's home," he said simply. He showed her around the property, explaining the workings of the ranch, from the branding of new calves to the rotation of pastures to prevent overgrazing. Abigail proved an attentive audience, asking insightful questions and occasionally jotting notes in a small book she carried. "For my lessons," she explained when she caught him watching her curiously. "Many of my students come from ranching families." Understanding their world helps me connect their daily experiences to their education. Her dedication impressed him. You take your teaching seriously. It's not merely a job to me, she said. It's a calling. Every child deserves the chance to develop their mind, to see possibilities beyond their current circumstances. Education is the key that unlocks those possibilities. They had reached the corral where Samuel kept his riding horses. Bess nickered in recognition, approaching the fence to nudge at Samuel's shoulder. She remembers you from the storm, Samuel said as Abigail cautiously reached out to stroke the mare's velvety nose. She's beautiful, Abigail said. Do you ride often? Every day. Can't run a cattle ranch from the porch. I've never been on a horse, she admitted. In Boston, we had streetcars and carriages for transportation. Samuel raised an eyebrow. Never. How did you get to the settlement to visit your student then? I walked. It didn't seem so far on the map. She laughed at herself. Clearly, I still have much to learn about Western distances. An idea formed in Samuel's mind. Would you like to learn? To ride, I mean. Her eyes widened. Now, no time like the present, and Bess here is the gentlest mount you could ask for a first lesson. Abigail hesitated only briefly before nodding. I would like that very much, though I should warn you I'm likely to be a terrible student. I doubt that, Samuel said, already moving to retrieve Bess's saddle and bridle. He adjusted the stirrups to accommodate Abigail's shorter legs, then led Bess to the mounting block. Abigail approached somewhat hesitantly, eyeing the horse's considerable height with newfound respect. She seems much larger from this perspective, she observed. You'll be fine, Samuel assured her. Bess has carried me through blizzards and flash floods. A riding lesson will be nothing to her. Abigail gathered her skirts thankfully. She wasn't wearing the restrictive Eastern fashions that would have made horseback riding impossible, and climbed onto the mounting block. With Samuel's guidance, she slid her foot into the stirrup and swung her other leg over Bess's back, settling somewhat awkwardly into the saddle. There, Samuel said, handing her the reins and showing her how to hold them. Not so difficult, is it? I feel as though I'm perched on top of a mountain, Abigail replied, her knuckles white around the reins. Samuel placed a steadying hand on Bess's bridle. Just sit straight and relax. Bess can feel your tension. Almost without thinking, he reached up to gently correct Abigail's posture, his hand briefly touching her lower back. Like this. Move with the horse, not against her. For the next hour, Samuel led Bess around the corral, instructing Abigail on the basics of horsemanship. Her initial nervousness gave way to enjoyment as she gained confidence, and by the end of the lesson, she was guiding Bess in slow circles without Samuel's direct assistance. This is wonderful, she exclaimed, a bright smile illuminating her face. I feel like I could ride forever. Maybe not today, Samuel said, hiding his own smile. Your muscles will be telling you differently come morning, I expect. He helped her dismount, his hands spanning her waist as he lifted her down. For a moment, they stood close, too close for propriety, her hands on his shoulders, his still at her waist. The moment stretched, filled with unspoken awareness before they both stepped back simultaneously. Thank you for the lesson, Abigail said, her cheeks flushed with more than just the excitement of riding. My pleasure, Samuel replied, meaning it more deeply than he'd meant anything in a long time. They walked back to the house, the conversation moving to safer topics: the spring planting, the progress of her students, the latest news from town. Samuel had prepared a simple meal beforehand, and they ate on the porch, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. I should get you back to town before dark, Samuel said eventually, though reluctantly. Abigail nodded, gathering her shawl around her shoulders as the evening air cooled. Yes, I suppose you should. I have lessons to prepare for tomorrow." As they rode back toward Independence, the prairie gilded with the last light of day, Samuel was struck by how different the world looked compared to just a few weeks ago. The landscape was the same: the rolling hills, the distant bluffs, the wide open sky, but his perception had altered. Where once he had seen only emptiness, now he noticed beauty. Where silence had been his only companion, now conversations and even laughter filled his days. And it was all because of the woman beside him, who had arrived in Independence with nothing but determination and principles, and who had somehow breached the walls he'd built around his heart without even trying. The thought terrified him even as it filled him with unfamiliar hope. At the boarding house, Samuel helped Abigail down from the wagon, conscious of the eyes of curious neighbors watching from windows and porches. Independence was a small town, and their outing would fuel gossip for days to come. "Thank you for today," Abigail said, looking up at him with earnest eyes. "For showing me your ranch for the riding lesson. I enjoyed it tremendously." "As did I," Samuel admitted. Perhaps we could do it again sometime." Her smile was answer enough, but she added, "I'd like that very much." As Samuel drove back to his ranch in the gathering darkness, he realized that for the first time in 6 years, he was looking forward to tomorrow, and the day after, and the days beyond that. It was a sensation so foreign that it took him miles of quiet contemplation to name it: hope. The following weeks saw a gradual but unmistakable change in Samuel Ironwood. Folks in Independence who had grown accustomed to his forbidding presence, his minimal interactions, and his hasty departures from town now observed with interest as he lingered in conversations, nodded greetings to passers-by, and occasionally, most shocking of all, smiled. The cause of this transformation was no mystery to anyone with eyes. Samuel and Abigail were frequently seen together riding on the outskirts of town, sharing meals at the small cafe, sitting side by side at the spring social that Samuel had not attended in years. Gossip flew, of course, but for once it held more curiosity than malice. For Samuel, each day brought new revelations. He discovered that Abigail had a quick wit that matched her intelligence, that she loved poetry but couldn't carry a tune to save her life, that she approached challenges with a blend of practicality and optimism that he found both baffling and admirable. He learned that her parents had been missionaries who had instilled in her both faith and a sense of duty to help others, that she had taught in a school for freed slaves in the South before coming west, and that, beneath her genteel manners, lay a core of steel that had served her well in her chosen profession. In turn, Abigail came to know Samuel not the bitter recluse of town legend, but the man beneath the grief and isolation. She learned of his love for the land, his encyclopedic knowledge of the territory's flora and fauna, his quiet but unwavering sense of justice. Bit by bit, as trust grew between them, he shared pieces of his past. His service in the war, his return to find his parents aging, his marriage to Elizabeth, and the devastating epidemic that had taken not only his wife but his parents within weeks of each other. "I couldn't save any of them," he told her one evening as they sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I was right here in this house, and I couldn't do a damn thing to stop it." Abigail's hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his own. "It wasn't your fault, Samuel. You know that, don't you?" He stared at the horizon. "Knowing and believing are different things." "Yes," she agreed softly, "they are." She didn't offer empty platitudes or easy reassurances, and Samuel was grateful for that. Instead, she simply sat with him, her presence a comfort he hadn't known he needed. As May turned to June, The town council meeting that would decide Abigail's fate approached. Despite pressure from certain quarters, she had not wavered in her insistence on teaching all of Independence's children, regardless of their background. The settlement families continued to send their children to her school, and though some town parents had initially withdrawn their children in protest, most had returned them when it became clear that Abigail's teaching was superior to any the town had known before. Still, Porter and his allies on the council held sway over the school's funding and Abigail's contract. The night before the meeting, Samuel found Abigail in the schoolhouse long after classes had ended, meticulously organizing student work for display. "You should be resting," he said from the doorway. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." She looked up, fatigue evident in the shadows beneath her eyes but determination undiminished. "I want them to see what these children have accomplished, what they're capable of, given the chance." Samuel moved into the room, surveying the carefully arranged displays, essays, arithmetic problems, maps, and drawings, all showing remarkable progress for a few months' work. "It's impressive, but Porter and his ilk won't care. Their minds are made up." "Perhaps," Abigail acknowledged. "But I have to try. These children deserve someone to fight for them." Samuel was struck, not for the first time, by her unwavering commitment to her principles. It was one of the things he admired most about her, and one of the things that frightened him most. If the council decided against her, she would leave Independence rather than compromise. The thought of her departure made his chest tighten painfully. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about what happens after tomorrow." Abigail set down the student essay she'd been arranging. "You mean if they don't renew my contract?" "Yes. I'll have to find a position elsewhere," she said, voicing the fear that had been growing in Samuel's mind. "There are other frontier towns in need of teachers, perhaps further west." The thought of her leaving, of returning to his solitary existence after having known the light she brought to his life, was unbearable. Samuel took a deep breath. "Or you could stay." Abigail looked up at him, confusion in her amber eyes. "Stay, without a position? How would I support myself?" "As my wife." The words hung in the air between them, momentous and irrevocable. Samuel hadn't planned to speak them, not here, not now, not like this. But now that they were said, he found he didn't regret them. Abigail's eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise. "Samuel, I love you," he said simply, the words feeling both foreign and absolutely right on his tongue. "I didn't expect to. I didn't want to. After Elizabeth, I thought that part of me was dead and buried. But then you arrived with your principles, and your courage, and your damn stubborn determination to see the best in everything, even in me, and somehow I found myself alive again." He moved closer, taking her hands in his. "I'm not an easy man, Abigail. God knows I'm rough around the edges, set in my ways. I've been alone so long I've forgotten how not to be. But if you'll have me, I swear I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of you." Tears shimmered in Abigail's eyes, but her voice was steady when she replied. "Samuel Ironwood, are you asking me to marry you because you love me, or because you're afraid I'll leave Independence if the council doesn't renew my contract?" "Both," he admitted honestly. "I love you, and I can't bear the thought of you leaving. But even if the council offers you a lifetime contract tomorrow, I'd still be standing here asking you to be my wife. Because these past months with you have been the first time in 6 years that I've felt like living instead of just existing." A tear slipped down Abigail's cheek. "I love you too, Samuel. When I came to Independence, I was looking for a place where I could make a difference, where I could put my principles into practice. I never expected to find someone who would make me question whether those principles were enough to build a life around." Samuel's heart seemed to stop. "Are you saying they're not?" I'm saying that for the first time I'm considering more than just my calling. I'm thinking about my heart as well." She took a deep breath. "Yes, I'll marry you, whether the council renews my contract or not. Because I love you, Samuel Ironwood, and I want to build a life with you." Relief and joy swept through Samuel with such force that he felt momentarily lightheaded. He pulled Abigail into his arms, holding her as if she might disappear if he let go. When their lips met, it was like coming home after a long, cold journey, warmth and belonging and rightness all at once. The council meeting the next day was a tense affair. The schoolroom was packed with townsfolk, settlement families, and students, all waiting to hear whether Miss Davidson would continue as Independence's teacher. Samuel sat in the back, his presence raising eyebrows among those who remembered his years of deliberate absence from town affairs. Porter and his allies made their case against renewal, citing Abigail's disruptive influence and inappropriate methods. But when it came time for Abigail to speak, she did so with such eloquence and passion about the progress her students had made that even Porter looked uncomfortable. What tipped the scales, however, was the unexpected intervention of Henderson from the general store, a respected businessman whose opinion carried weight. "My own grandson couldn't read a word when Miss Davidson arrived," he said, standing to address the council. "Now he reads to me from the newspaper every evening. I don't much care who sits next to him while he learns, as long as he learns. And if Miss Davidson says all children deserve that chance, well, I reckon she's right." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. One by one, other parents stood to speak in Abigail's favor, town parents and settlement parents alike. When the council finally voted, it was 4-1 in favor of renewal, with only Porter dissenting. The schoolroom erupted in cheers. Students rushed to surround Abigail, their faces alight with relief and joy. Samuel remained in his seat, watching the woman he loved receive the recognition she deserved. When the celebration quieted and the room began to empty, he finally approached her. "Congratulations, Miss Davidson," he said formally, though his eyes conveyed much more. "Thank you, Mr. Ironwood," she replied, her own eyes dancing with happiness. "It seems I'll be staying in Independence after all." "That's fortunate," he said, "as I understand you have a wedding to plan." Word of their engagement spread through Independence like wildfire. Many expressed surprise, though those who had observed them together over the past months admitted they could see the sense in it. The bitter recluse and the principled schoolteacher might seem an unlikely pair on the surface, but those with eyes to see recognized the way they balanced each other, her light complementing his shadows, his steadiness anchoring her idealism. They were married on a brilliant July morning, with half the town in attendance. The ceremony was held on Samuel's ranch, their ranch now beneath the shade of the old oak tree, where generations of Ironwoods had celebrated life's milestones. Abigail wore a simple white dress with wildflowers in her hair, and Samuel, standing beside her in a new suit, looked at her with such naked adoration that even the most cynical observers found themselves blinking back unexpected tears. "I never thought I'd have this again," Samuel confessed that night as they lay together in what was now their bedroom, the moonlight casting silver patterns on the walls. "A companion, a purpose beyond just surviving another day." Abigail rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "And I never expected to find love in a place so far from everything I knew, but here we are, he echoed, pulling her closer. The months that followed were a time of adjustment and joy. Samuel, so long accustomed to solitude, had to learn the rhythms of sharing his life with another person. Abigail, raised in the bustle of Boston, adapted to the realities of ranch life with determination and good humor. They transformed the ranch house together, bringing out the keepsake Samuel had packed away and adding Abigail's own touches until it truly felt like a home again. Abigail continued teaching, riding to and from town on Bess each day. Her students, both from town and the settlement, often visited the ranch on weekends, filling the once quiet homestead with laughter and activity. Samuel, initially wary of so much youthful energy, found himself gradually drawn into their world, teaching the children about ranching, wildlife, and the history of the territory. By the time winter arrived, bringing with it the first snowfall of the season, Samuel could scarcely remember the man he had been before Abigail entered his life, the bitter, isolated shell who had existed rather than lived. That man seemed like a distant acquaintance now, viewed through the lens of present happiness. On Christmas Eve, as they sat before the fire in their cozy home, Abigail presented Samuel with a small wrapped package. "An early Christmas gift," she explained, her eyes shining with a secret joy. Inside was a tiny pair of hand-knitted booties. Samuel stared at them, his mind working to catch up with what his heart already understood. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice hushed with wonder and fear. Abigail nodded, taking his hand and placing it gently on her still flat stomach. "The doctor confirmed it yesterday. Our child will arrive in the summer." Samuel had thought himself incapable of feeling more love than he already did for Abigail, but in that moment, his heart seemed to expand beyond all previous boundaries. With that expansion came terror, the memory of loss, the knowledge of all that could go wrong in this dangerous, unpredictable world. Abigail, reading his thoughts as she so often did, placed her hand against his cheek. "I know you're afraid," she said softly. "So am I. But we can't let fear rob us of joy, Samuel. That's no way to honor those we've lost." He covered her hand with his own, turning to press a kiss to her palm. "How did you get so wise, Abigail Ironwood?" "I had an excellent teacher," she replied, her lips curving in a smile. "A certain stubborn rancher who taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to face it anyway." As they sat together before the fire, snow falling gently outside their window, Samuel reflected on the strange, wonderful journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, he had been a man entombed in grief, moving through life like a ghost in his own story. Now he was a husband, soon to be a father, with a future stretching before him filled with possibilities he had long ago ceased to imagine. It wasn't just that Abigail had brought light back into his darkened world. She had reminded him that he was capable of generating his own light, that the capacity for joy had been within him all along, merely dormant, waiting for the right moment, the right person to awaken it again. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the prairie in a pristine blanket of white. Inside, in the warmth of their home, Samuel held his wife close, their hearts beating in time with the promise of new life, new beginnings, and a love that had defied even the most bitter of losses to bloom again beneath the vast western sky. Summer arrived with blazing heat and cloudless skies, turning the prairie to gold and filling the air with the scent of sun-warmed grass. By then, Abigail's condition was evident to all, her rounded belly a source of constant wonder to Samuel. The school term had ended, giving her time to prepare for the baby's arrival and escape the worst of the summer heat. In the cool of the evenings, they would sit on the porch, Samuel's hand resting on Abigail's stomach, to feel their child's movements, kicks and rolls that made them both laugh with delight. They spoke of the future, of plans for the ranch, of the kind of parents they hoped to be. "What shall we name him?" Samuel asked one such evening, the sunset painting the sky in vivid oranges and pinks. "Him?" Abigail raised an eyebrow. "Are you so certain it's a boy?" just a feeling," Samuel admitted, "though I'd be equally happy with a daughter." Abigail considered, her hands cradling her belly. "If it is a boy, I thought perhaps William after my father, and if it's a girl—" "Elizabeth," Samuel said softly, "after my first wife, if you wouldn't mind." Abigail's eyes filled with understanding. "I think that would be beautiful. A way of honoring her memory, of keeping it alive in our family." Family. The word still struck Samuel with its simple power, its promise of belonging. After years of being alone, he was part of something larger again, a circle that would soon expand to include their child. The baby arrived on a sweltering August day, after a labor that left Samuel pacing the porch while the midwife and her assistant attended to Abigail inside. Every cry of pain from the bedroom sent a fresh wave of terror through him, memories of Elizabeth's death threatening to overwhelm his hope for Abigail's safe delivery. But then, just as the sun was setting, a different cry filled the house, the indignant wail of a newborn announcing its arrival to the world. Minutes later, the midwife appeared at the door, her face tired but wreathed in a smile. "You have a son, Mr. Ironwood," she announced. "A healthy boy. And your wife is doing just fine." The relief that washed over Samuel was so profound that his legs nearly buckled. He entered the bedroom to find Abigail propped up on pillows, her face flushed and damp with perspiration but radiant with joy. In her arms was a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Samuel," she said, her voice weary but triumphant, "come meet your son." He approached the bed almost reverently, sitting carefully beside her. Abigail pulled back the edge of the blanket to reveal a tiny face, eyes screwed shut, wisps of dark hair plastered to a perfect scalp. "William Samuel Ironwood," Abigail said softly. "If you approve." Samuel could only nod, words having deserted him entirely. He reached out a tentative finger to stroke his son's cheek, marveling at the impossible softness of new skin. "He's perfect," he managed finally, his voice thick with emotion. "You're perfect. God, Abigail, I love you so much." "And I love you," she replied, leaning into him as he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Both of you, more than I could ever express." As they sat together, the new family complete in that moment of perfect communion, Samuel thought of all the twists and turns of fate that had brought them to this point. The war that had hardened him, the epidemic that had nearly destroyed him, the chance encounter on a rainy day that had saved him. If any one of those events had gone differently, he might never have known this joy, this fullness of heart that made everything that came before worth enduring. The years ahead would bring challenges, of course. Life on the frontier was never easy, and raising a child in such a world would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. But as Samuel held his wife and son in the gathering dusk of that August evening, he felt a certainty that whatever came, they would face it together. Outside the window, the first star of evening appeared in the darkening sky. Inside, in the warm circle of lamplight, Samuel Ironwood, once bitter and alone, now husband and father, bent to kiss his wife's brow and whisper a prayer of gratitude for the light she had brought back into his world. 5 years passed, bringing changes to both the Ironwood family and Independence itself. The railroad had finally reached the town, bringing with it new settlers, new businesses, and a sense of prosperity that transformed the once struggling frontier outpost. The settlement on the outskirts gradually integrated with the town proper, though not without continuing tensions that required Abigail's diplomatic skills to navigate. The ranch flourished under Samuel and Abigail's combined care. They had added a new wing to the house, hired additional hands to help with the expanded herd, and established one of the finest breeding programs in the territory. Samuel's expertise with cattle was matched by Abigail's head for business, and together They had created something that neither could have accomplished alone. Young William, now a sturdy 5-year-old with his father's blue eyes and his mother's quick mind, was joined by a 3-year-old sister, Elizabeth, whose curly chestnut hair and determined spirit made her the image of her namesake, according to Samuel. The house that had once echoed with Samuel's solitary footsteps now rang with children's laughter, debates over breakfast, songs around the piano Abigail had insisted on having shipped from St. Louis, and all the beautiful chaos of family life. Abigail had reluctantly given up her position at the school when Elizabeth was born, finding the demands of teaching, ranching, and mothering 2 young children too much even for her considerable energy. But she hadn't abandoned her principles or her commitment to education. Instead, she had established a small school on the ranch itself, where she taught not only her own children but those of the ranch hands and neighboring homesteaders who found the distance to town too great for daily attendance. On a crisp October afternoon, as golden leaves drifted from the cottonwoods along the creek, Samuel returned from checking the north pasture to find an unusual sight. A fine carriage parked in the yard, its black lacquer gleaming in the autumn sun. He dismounted, handing Bess's reins to one of the hands with a questioning look. "Lady from back east," the young man explained. "Arrived about an hour ago asking for Mrs. Ironwood. The missus took her into the parlor." Samuel nodded his thanks and headed toward the house, curious about this unexpected visitor. As he entered, he could hear voices from the parlor, Abigail's familiar tones and another woman's, cultured and precise in a way that immediately marked her as Eastern. He paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. Abigail sat opposite a woman in her 50s, elegantly dressed in a traveling suit that must have cost more than a year's profit from the ranch. The stranger's gray-streaked hair was arranged in an elaborate style that seemed wildly impractical for frontier travel, and her posture was rigid even as she sipped tea from one of Abigail's best cups. "Samuel," Abigail said, catching sight of him. There was an odd tension in her voice that immediately put him on alert. "May I present Mrs. Eleanor Prescott from Boston. Mrs. Prescott, my husband, Samuel Ironwood." The woman's eyes swept over Samuel, taking in his work clothes, his sun-browned skin, his calloused hands. Her smile was polite but cool. "Mr. Ironwood, a pleasure to meet you at last." "Mrs. Prescott," Samuel replied, moving to stand beside Abigail's chair, instinctively positioning himself as if to protect her from some threat. "What brings you all the way from Boston to our humble ranch, Mrs.?" "Prescott is a representative of the Women's Educational Association," Abigail explained, her fingers twisting the fabric of her skirt in a nervous gesture Samuel hadn't seen in years. "She's touring Western territories to assess educational needs and opportunities. And to check on some of our former colleagues," Mrs. Prescott added smoothly. "Abigail was one of our most promising teachers before she chose to pursue other paths." There was something in the woman's tone that set Samuel's teeth on edge, a hint of condescension, of judgment, but before he could respond, William burst into the room, followed closely by Elizabeth, both children flushed with excitement. "Papa," William exclaimed. "Tommy says there's a carriage outside with real silver on the wheels. Can we see it?" "Is it a princess carriage?" Elizabeth asked, her blue eyes wide with wonder. "Like in the story book, Mrs." Prescott's expression softened marginally at the sight of the children, though her posture remained rigid. "And these must be your children. They're quite spirited." "William, Elizabeth," Abigail said, her voice regaining its usual warmth as she addressed her children. "This is Mrs. Prescott, an old friend of mine from Boston. Say hello, please, and then you may go outside to look at the carriage, but do not touch it, and stay where Marta can see you." The children dutifully offered their greetings before racing back outside, their excitement uncontained. Samuel watched them go with a smile before turning his attention back to their visitor. "You must be tired after such a long journey, Mrs. Prescott," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Will you be staying in Independence long?" "Just overnight," she replied. "I have several other stops to make before returning east, but I did want to speak with Abigail about a matter of some importance." Her eyes shifted to Abigail. "Perhaps we could continue our discussion in private," Samuel felt rather than saw Abigail stiffen beside him. "Samuel and I have no secrets from each other, Mrs. Prescott. Whatever you wish to say to me can be said in his presence." Mrs. Prescott's lips thinned slightly, but she nodded. "Very well. As I was explaining before your husband arrived, the association has received a substantial endowment to establish a women's college in Boston. Not merely a finishing school, but a true institution of higher learning for women. We're recruiting the finest female educators in the country to serve as founding faculty." She paused, her gaze fixed on Abigail. "Your name was among the first proposed, Abigail. Your work with freed slaves after the war, your papers on educational philosophy, they're still discussed in Boston circles. This is an opportunity to be part of something historic, something that will shape women's education for generations to come." Samuel felt as if the floor had suddenly dropped away beneath his feet. He looked at Abigail, whose face had gone very still. "You're offering me a teaching position in Boston," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "A professorship," Mrs. Prescott corrected. "With a salary 3 times what you were earning as a schoolteacher, housing provided, and the chance to help shape the curriculum from the beginning. It's the opportunity of a lifetime, Abigail, the kind of position you always dreamed of." Samuel remained silent, his mind racing. It was true. This was exactly the sort of opportunity Abigail had spoken of in the early days of their acquaintance, before their lives had intertwined so completely. A chance to implement her educational philosophies on a grand scale, to influence not just a roomful of students but an entire institution. To return to the cultured society she had left behind. For a terrible moment, he was back in that place of fear and isolation, imagining life without her warmth, her laughter, her steadfast presence that had healed his wounded heart and given him a reason to live again. The thought was so painful that he had to fight to keep his expression neutral. Abigail's hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his own in a gesture that immediately steadied him. "It sounds like a remarkable opportunity," she said to Mrs. Prescott, "and I'm honored to have been considered. But my life is here now, my family, my home, my own school." Mrs. Prescott's eyebrows rose. "Your school? You mean the informal lessons you offer to ranch children? Surely you can't compare that to a professorship at a proper college, can I?" Abigail's voice took on the quiet intensity that Samuel recognized as a sign of her deepest convictions. "Here, I teach children who would otherwise have no education at all. I see the direct impact of my work every day in my students' progress, in their growing confidence, in the opportunities that open to them because they can read and cipher and think critically." She squeezed Samuel's hand before continuing. "And yes, my family is here. My husband, whose strength and character I admire more than anyone I've ever known. My children, who are learning not just from books but from this land, from the people who work it, from the challenges and joys of frontier life. This may not be the path I originally envisioned for myself, Mrs. Prescott, but it is the one I have chosen, and I have never regretted that choice for a moment." Pride swelled in Samuel's chest, alongside a relief so profound it made him lightheaded. Mrs. Prescott, however, looked genuinely perplexed. "But Abigail, you were meant for greater things than this," she protested, gesturing vaguely at their surroundings. "Your mind, your talents, to waste them in this wilderness. There is no waste in a life lived with purpose and love." Abigail interrupted, her tone gentle but firm. "I'm grateful for the offer, truly. And I'm pleased to know my early work is still remembered, but my answer is no." Mrs. Prescott stayed another hour, making increasingly desperate attempts to change Abigail's mind, but eventually departed for independence with her mission unfulfilled. Samuel and Abigail stood on the porch, watching the fancy carriage disappear down the road toward town. "Did you ever regret it?" Samuel asked quietly when the carriage was out of sight. "Leaving Boston, coming west, giving up the kind of opportunities she described?" Abigail turned to face him, her amber eyes clear and direct. "Never," she said simply. "Not once." She smiled up at him, the same smile that had first pierced his defenses all those years ago. "I found everything I was looking for here, Samuel, and so much more that I never knew to look for at all." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the autumn wind swirled fallen leaves around their feet. In the distance, they could hear William and Elizabeth's laughter as they played near the barn, the everyday sounds of the ranch continuing around them, horses nickering, cattle lowing, hands calling to each other as they went about their work. It was not the life either of them had imagined for themselves in their youth. It was harder in some ways, simpler in others, and infinitely richer than they could have predicted. Together, they had built something neither could have created alone: a home, a family, a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Samuel looked down at the woman in his arms, the woman who had brought light back into his darkened world, and felt a contentment so deep it bordered on awe. "I love you, Abigail Ironwood," he said, the words no less powerful for having been said thousands of times before. "And I love you," she replied, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his. "Today, tomorrow, always." From bitter solitude to abundant joy, from darkness to light, their journey had not been an easy one. But as they stood together in the golden afternoon of their shared life, both Samuel and Abigail knew with absolute certainty that every step had been worth taking. For in finding each other, they had found not just love, but home,